My own family erased me from photos, chats, even my mother's will, until I exposed them with $1 billion and shattered their legacy.
I should have known the night was doomed the moment the valet looked at me twice and asked who I was there to see. It wasn't a cruel question, he asked with the same polite confusion you'd give a stranger who had wandered into the wrong hotel. But it was enough. Enough to remind me that in my family's world, I had become an outsider. Even before I stepped through the doors. The gala was the kind of event people didn't attend to eat, but to be seen. Glass chandeliers hanging like constellations, polished marble floors that echoed every step. Laughter spilling in practiced bursts from groups who had perfected the art of appearing important. I walked in alone, holding the embossed invitation I had confirmed weeks earlier. My name wasn't misspelled. My seat number was clear. And yet, as soon as I crossed that glittering threshold, the air shifted. Not in temperature, something colder. Recognition withheld, on purpose. I scanned the room, searching for even one familiar smile. None came. Not my sisters, not my aunts. Not even the faint acknowledgement of a cousin who used to borrow my clothes and swear we'd be best friends forever. Faces turned deliberately away. Conversations rose just slightly louder when I passed. I felt it before I understood it. This wasn't oversight. This was choreography. The first blow came quickly. My brother-in-law Damon, tall, sharp-suited, carrying himself with the kind of arrogance that passes for confidence in boardrooms, appeared at the registration desk just as I was handing over my ticket. He leaned close enough for the clerk to hear and said, "Check again. She likes to show up where she doesn't belong." His tone wasn't loud, but it carried. The clerk froze, caught between duty and the weight of his authority. I forced a smile, the kind you practice when you're too polite to scream, and said evenly, "My name is on the list." Damon let out a laugh, quiet, contained, the laugh of a man who knows the room will follow his lead. Then, louder this time, so the nearby tables could enjoy the spectacle, "She's here again, pretending she belongs. Maybe check the shelter, downtown. That's where her kind usually signs in." There it was. My name stripped away, replaced with the word he'd been saving for years. Beggar. The word didn't slice, it spread. A ripple of polite chuckles, a few sideways glances, a cluster of women covering their mouths with jeweled hands. They laughed not because it was funny, but because it was easier than objecting, easier than siding with me. I didn't flinch. I didn't hand him the satisfaction of a win. I simply nodded, stepped aside as if I had been heading toward the restrooms all along, and walked deeper into the hall. My heels clicked against the marble in a rhythm, too sharp, too loud. Like a drumbeat announcing retreat disguised as composure. No one followed. No one asked if I was all right. And in that silence, I realized something that hurt worse than Damon's cruelty. It wasn't the insult. It wasn't the laughter. It was the quiet consent of everyone else. They didn't need to erase me with scissors and captions, they could do it by looking straight through me. I found a seat in the shadows. At a table near the back where the servers dropped plates, no one claimed. From there, I could see them. Clearly, my sister Vivian radiant under the soft lighting. Damon at her side with his polished grin, their circle of friends laughing as if rehearsed. A tableau of perfection, one I had been cropped out of long ago. I sat still, staring at the glass of water in front of me. It shimmered with reflections of chandeliers and polished silverware, but none of it touched me. I thought about how often this had happened, in smaller ways. The invitations that never came. The photographs where I was half blurred, cut at the edges. The family jokes I never heard until they were already retold as memories. Tonight was no accident. Tonight was the declaration. By the time the first toast rang out across the hall, I already knew. They weren't ignoring me. They were erasing me. And that is where this story truly begins, not in the laughter that humiliated me, but in the silence that followed. Because silence has weight. And when you carry enough of it, you start to hear the echoes of every moment you were written out of the frame. I didn't know then how far they had gone, or how long they had been planning, but I felt it deep in my bones. This wasn't an isolated cruelty. This was the final stage of a pattern. A pattern that would stretch far beyond a gala table, far beyond whispered jokes, into documents, into inheritance, into the very structure of who my family wanted the world to believe existed. That night, I sat in the shadows and watched them toast without me, laughing like they had won. I didn't toast, I didn't drink. I simply sat, silent, and began counting the ways they had already erased me. And that silence would carry me straight into the next. Revelation when I discovered the proof that their erasure wasn't social at all. It was legal. People like to say families forget sometimes. They miss a name on a card. They overlook a chair at the table. They crop a photo without realizing who got cut out. Forgetting is human. But what happened to me wasn't forgetting. It was design. I first started to notice it years before that gala. It began with photographs. At birthdays, holidays, weddings, any gathering that required someone to line up, smile, and pretend. When the pictures were printed or posted online, I was either shoved to the edges, blurred in the background, or missing altogether. Once, I saw a Thanksgiving portrait with the caption, "Everyone made it this year." I had been there, seated at the far end of the table, carving pie while everyone else posed. Yet to the world, I wasn't. And it didn't stop with photographs. Family group chats would light up with messages planning vacations, holidays, even Sunday dinners. I would find out only later when someone slipped and said, "Didn't you get the text?" No, I hadn't. My phone stayed silent while theirs buzzed with belonging. The sharpest memory came on my niece's 10th birthday. I had bought a carefully wrapped gift, a necklace engraved with her initials, the kind of keepsake you imagine a child might hold onto for years. When I arrived, the party was already in full swing. My sister Vivian greeted me with a smile so polished it could have been borrowed from a magazine cover. "You made it," she said, as if my presence had been an afterthought. Hours later, I discovered the family photo from that day, the one they framed, the one that hung in their hallway. I wasn't in it. Not behind a shoulder, not half-cropped, not even blurred. Just gone, as though I had never stood in the room at all. That was Vivian's gift. My older sister. To the outside world, she was grace and warmth, a perfect wife, a perfect mother, a perfect daughter. In her shadow, I was the other Carver sister. The less polished one. The one whose presence was tolerated but never celebrated. She had a way of smiling with her mouth while her eyes told me to shrink smaller, speak softer, and disappear faster. And yet, for years, I told myself it was me. I was too quiet, too hesitant, too unwilling to fight for attention. Maybe invisibility was my fault? Maybe if I had dressed differently, spoken louder, made myself indispensable, things would have changed. But then the pattern became undeniable. You don't accidentally erase the same person over and over. You don't crop out the same sibling year after year without meaning to. The truth hit hardest after our mother's funeral. People stood in clusters, recalling memories, exchanging sympathy. I overheard someone ask Vivian how many siblings she had. She smiled faintly and said, "Just me." I was the only daughter. I froze. The words weren't a slip. They were deliberate, spoken with ease, with practice. In that moment, I wasn't just forgotten, I was rewritten. It took me a long time to accept what was happening, to understand that being invisible wasn't the result of my silence. It was the result of their decision. They wanted a narrative where Vivian was the shining heir and I was the ghost they could edit out of every frame. But invisibility has one sharp edge. They assumed I wouldn't see what they were doing. They thought I would accept the role of background character forever. They didn't realize that when you're pushed to the edges, you notice details no one else does. You notice where the seams start to split. And that's how I began to see it in documents, in signatures, in the spaces where my name used to be, now replaced by nothing. What they erased from the photo albums, they had started to erase from something far more permanent. That was when I stopped blaming myself. Because ghosts don't just vanish, they are created. And I was about to find proof that my erasure wasn't social at all. It was legal, and it was deliberate. Grief makes you blind. That's what I tell myself when I think back to the weeks after my mother's funeral. Everyone around me seemed to move with rehearsed precision arrangements, condolences, paperwork while I stumbled through the haze of losing the one person who had ever made me feel seen. I trusted too much, accepted too quickly, and that trust was the crack they slipped through. The will was read in a quiet office, blinds drawn, the air thick with the scent of leather chairs and old wood. The lawyer cleared his throat, and page after page was read out loud in the kind of monotone that reduces a life to legal clauses. I remember gripping the arms of my chair, waiting for my name, my share, my recognition. But the words never came. Property to Vivian, accounts to Vivian, business holdings to Vivian and her husband Damon. My name was absent, as if it had been erased with a steady, deliberate hand. I didn't speak. My voice was locked somewhere beneath shock. When the reading ended, Vivian reached over, patted my knee, and whispered, "Don't take it personally. Mom just wanted to keep things simple." She smiled as if it were mercy. For weeks, I carried that explanation like a stone in my chest. Simplicity. Maybe my mother thought leaving everything to one child would prevent disputes. Maybe she believed I didn't need it. Maybe. But grief has a way of masking betrayal until the ache dulls. Just enough for you to notice the inconsistencies. It happened one night months later. I was sorting through old boxes in my apartment. The kind you keep tucked away because opening them feels like tearing scars that never healed. Buried beneath tax forms and photographs, I found a slim green folder. Inside, neatly clipped, was a draft of my mother's will dated 2 years earlier. My hands trembled as I read it. Section 4. Allocation of estate property. The name printed clearly. My name, Elena Carver. No typos, no vague titles, no room for interpretation. The shock almost made me laugh. For months, I had been mourning, not just my mother but the idea that she had left me nothing, that in her final days she had decided I was undeserving. Yet here was proof, in black and white, that she had thought of me, written me in, secured my place. Somewhere between that draft and the reading at the lawyer's office, I had been erased, not by time, not by my mother, by someone else. I read the signatures carefully. The draft was notarized in May, long before she was hospitalized. But at the funeral, the lawyer had presented a version signed only 3 days before her death. My stomach turned. In those final days, my mother had been heavily medicated, barely able to hold a pen. Yet somehow a new will had appeared, cleaner, simpler, with my name neatly excised. I couldn't shake the timeline. The draft in my hands proved intent. The final version proved manipulation. And the difference between the two proved something darker: fraud. For the first time since her death, grief gave way to anger. Not the kind that burns hot and then fades, but the cold kind. The kind that settles deep in your chest and refuses to leave. Someone had taken advantage of her weakness to cut me out, not just of money, but of history. They had stolen my mother's voice and used it to erase me. I stared at the papers scattered across my floor. Each clause, each line, each signature was no longer just legal text, it was evidence. Evidence that my sister had lied. Evidence that Damon's smirk at the gala was more than cruelty, it was confidence. They hadn't just humiliated me in public, they had rewritten the truth in private. That night, I sat at my desk with the folder open, the draft on one side, my memories on the other. And one sentence pounding in my head: they didn't forget me, they deleted me. But anger is nothing without action, and I knew if I kept this to myself, it would rot inside me. I needed to know how deep the edit went, who had touched the documents, who had authorized the changes. And there was only one person who might hold the key: Carla Greer, a paralegal who used to work for my mother's attorney. She had been there during the estate discussions, quiet in the background, but always watching. If anyone knew whether a last-minute revision had been slipped in, it would be her. So I drafted an email, short and sharp, before I could lose my nerve. "Carla, do you know if any revisions were made to my mother's will in the final 30 days before her death?" My finger hovered only a moment before hitting send. As the message left my inbox, I felt the first surge of something I hadn't felt in years. Not hope, not even courage. It was clarity. The kind that comes when you finally see the outline of the knife that's been at your back the whole time. The reply came by morning. Only one line, but it was enough to stop me cold. "You may want to check the access logs." Something was amended remotely on a Saturday night. I froze. Saturday night. I flipped open my old planner, scanned the date. That weekend I had been in Toronto for work, no cell service, cut off completely. I hadn't even known my mother had been moved to hospice until I returned. While I was out of reach, someone had amended her will. Someone close enough to her bedside, close enough to the lawyer, close enough to make the change without me ever knowing. And suddenly the humiliation at the gala, the years of being cropped out of photos, the whispers that I was ungrateful, they all made sense. The erasure had never been accidental. It had been calculated. And if they could manipulate the law itself to erase me from my own bloodline, then I had to ask, how much further were they willing to go? That question would lead me to the next confrontation, the next wall of silence, and the beginning of a campaign not just to humiliate me, but to paint me as unfit to stand at all. The morning after Carla's email, I woke with a pounding certainty. I needed answers. I had proof that my name once existed in my mother's will. I had proof that it had been erased. What I didn't have was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, I thought, would be the crack that widened everything. So I started, where you're supposed to I dialed my Aunt Sylvia, the woman who once braided my hair when I was little, the woman who swore to my mother she'd always watch over me. She answered quickly, her voice thick with the comfort of routine. But the moment I asked if she had heard anything about changes to the will in those final weeks, her tone shifted. "Don't dig into this, Alina," she said. "It won't bring your mother back. You'll only embarrass yourself." Embarrass myself. As if asking whether I existed in my mother's last wishes was a shameful act. I asked if she had seen Vivian with the lawyers, if she had heard whispers about late-night meetings. Sylvia sighed, long and heavy. "Vivian knows what she's doing. She's protecting the family. Why can't you just accept that?" The word protecting lodged in my chest. Protecting who? Protecting what? Certainly not me. I hung up before the conversation could twist further, but the residue of her dismissal clung to me like smoke. My next call was to the attorney's office itself. I gave my name, steady and clear, and asked to speak with whoever was overseeing my mother's estate. The receptionist's voice was polite, practiced, but carried the edge of someone reading from a script. "I'm sorry, Ms. Carver. We've been instructed to work only through the executor, Vivian," I said flatly. A pause, then the confirmation, crisp as glass breaking. "Yes, Ms. Wells is our listed contact." I pushed again, told her I was a direct heir, that I had documents contradicting the final version. There was a silence, then the kind of clipped reply that leaves no room for argument. "Not in the final document, Ms. Carver. Not in the final document." As though those words were the end of the story. I ended the call quietly, but inside my mind screamed. I wanted to march into that office, slam the two wills on the table, and demand they look me in the eye. Instead, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, staring at the papers spread across my desk. It was becoming clear. No one was going to validate what I found. They weren't just shutting doors. They were painting me as ungrateful, unstable, grasping at shadows. Each denial, each dismissal, carried the same message. Stop digging, stop asking, stop existing. But whispers cut both ways. If my family was already whispering that I was unstable, then I needed my own whispers proof. That could speak louder than their silence. That was the moment my anger cooled into strategy. If they were determined to deny me in words, I would make the documents speak for me. And so, instead of reaching for the phone again, I reached for the folder, spread it wider across my desk, and began to prepare for something far more invasive than questions. Because the next discovery wouldn't come from what people admitted out loud. It would come from the trails they left behind in the places they thought I'd never look. Denial is one thing. Silence is another. But exile, that is something altogether different. It started with a screen. I logged into the joint family account. One evening, the one my mother had set up years ago to cover household expenses. The same account I had deposited into faithfully, month after month. The login page froze, then blinked red. Access restricted. I tried again, typing slower, as if precision would change the outcome. Same message. I thought it was a glitch, so I checked another account. One I knew was tied to my name. Error, contact administrator. Administrator. My pulse kicked. I was the administrator. Or at least, I had been. Within an hour, I realized it wasn't a glitch at all. Every account connected to my family's network had been locked. The trust fund. The joint investments. Even an old savings account my mother had opened for me in college, the one she said would always be just for you. All sealed off. All inaccessible. I called the bank. The representative's voice was cheerful, almost rehearsed. "As per the executor's instructions," she said, "all modifications must be authorized through the designated representative." "Vivian," I whispered into the receiver. The pause that followed was confirmation enough. When I hung up, my hands felt cold, almost foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. I wasn't just locked out of money. I was locked out of proof. Proof that I had contributed. Proof that I had belonged. But the financial exile was only the first blow. Later that night, out of habit, I opened the family group chat, the one that had carried updates during my mother's illness, the one where schedules and meals and hospital visits were organized. The thread was gone, not archived, not muted, gone. I scrolled back months, searching, but it had been erased from my phone entirely, as if I had never been part of it. I typed a test message into the search bar. "Are you there?" But it came back empty. No result, no thread, no history. I felt the sting of it sharper than any courtroom denial. Photos of hospital visits, memories of whispered updates, jokes we had sent each other to keep the fear at bay all vanished. As though I had never kept vigil by her bedside. As though I had never been there at all. The pattern was too precise to be coincidence. First the bank, then the chat, then the records. When I checked a digital copy of a property deed, my name appeared misspelled, Alana Carver's. A single letter changed, but enough to ensure that any search, any cross-reference, would fail to recognize me. It was surgical. Clean erasure masked as clerical error. A war fought not with fists or open threats, but with deletions, omissions, and edits so subtle they could pass as mistakes. That was the moment I understood the scale. My exile wasn't social anymore. It was systemic. It lived in accounts, in databases, in signatures filed away in cabinets I no longer had keys to. I stared at the glowing screen, my reflection warped across the glass. They thought they were cutting me out quietly, with no evidence left behind. But deletions leave fingerprints, and fingerprints can be traced. So I opened a new folder on my laptop, labeled it proof, and began collecting screenshots, error messages, digital receipts, every locked account, every misspelled record, every vanished thread. If they wanted to erase me, I would make the erasure itself the evidence. And in that quiet, my anger hardened into resolve. Because if they could rewrite me out of digital existence, then I had to find the one person who still remembered me without edits. The only question was whether that ally still had the courage to hand me the truth. When you're cut out of every circle, when doors slam quietly but firmly in your face, you stop expecting anyone to stand with you. Exile teaches you to assume silence means abandonment. So when the call came, I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was low, familiar. It's Marcus. Marcus, my mother's driver. For 20 years, he had been the quiet figure in the background opening doors, carrying groceries, waiting patiently outside family dinners, while the rest of us argued inside. I hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. "I need to see you," he said. "Not at the house. Somewhere private." We met that evening at a coffee shop tucked between an auto repair shop and a laundromat, ordinary enough to be invisible. He walked in wearing his old cap, the same one he used to tip when greeting my mother. His face looked tired, carved with lines I hadn't noticed before. He slid into the booth across from me, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might have followed him. Then, without preamble, he pulled a small sealed envelope from his coat pocket and placed it between us. His hand lingered on it for a second too long. "She told me to give you this," he said. His voice cracked just slightly, but only when the time was right. I stared at it, afraid to touch it. "When did she give it to you?" "A week before she lost her voice," he replied. She said they'd try to erase you. She knew what was coming." The air between us went still. I reached for the envelope with hands that didn't feel steady. Inside was a folded letter and a USB drive wrapped carefully in tissue. The letter was in her handwriting, slanted, looping, unmistakably hers. I unfolded it slowly, bracing myself for whatever she had chosen to leave me. Her words were brief, but they carried the weight of everything she hadn't been able to say in those final days. "If they erase you, fight. You were always meant to lead, not to follow." My throat tightened. It wasn't money. It wasn't property. It was validation. Proof that she had seen me, that my absence from the will wasn't her choice. With trembling fingers, I slid the USB into my laptop later that night. The video was grainy, recorded from her bedroom. She looked fragile, her voice faint, but her eyes, they were steady. "Alina," she said, pausing between each word, as if summoning the strength to hold the syllables together. "I know they've made you feel like a shadow, but you are the light that keeps this family real." The screen went black. I sat in the dark for a long time, the glow of the laptop fading into silence. For months, I had been questioning myself, was I too sensitive, too paranoid, too desperate to belong? That doubt evaporated with her voice. She knew. She had always known. When I looked back at the envelope, I noticed something else. A slip of paper Marcus had tucked inside. Handwritten in his blocky script. "Be careful. They watch everything." That warning followed me into the night. If Marcus had been brave enough to carry her truth this far, then it meant the danger was real. It meant the edits weren't just about inheritance, they were about control. And if I had proof of their scheme now, then the next step was clear. I couldn't just hold her words. I had to weaponize them. There's a moment when grief hardens. into something sharper, when you stop asking for fairness and start planning for survival. That night, with my mother's letter in one hand and the USB still glowing in my laptop, I felt the shift. They had erased me from photos, from chats, from accounts, even from the will. But they had overlooked something. Years ago, when I was still naive enough to believe in possibility, I had scraped together what little I had and invested in a startup called LinksGen Technologies. Back then, it was a handful of engineers, working out of a converted warehouse, a dream wrapped in duct tape. My family had laughed. Vivian had raised a glass of wine and said, "Elena thinks she's a venture capitalist now." Damon had smirked, asking if I even knew what biotech was. I hadn't needed to know. I just believed in people who built from nothing, because I knew what that felt like. I hadn't thought about LinksGen in years. Life had buried it under the noise of bills and funerals and exile. But now, desperate for something that was mine alone, I searched for their name. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as if afraid the screen would mock me too. The results nearly knocked the breath out of me. LinksGen was on the verge of going public. Their valuation had soared into the hundreds of millions. And tucked in the shareholder records, my name still there. My shares hadn't been touched, hadn't been reassigned, hadn't been erased. Somehow, through all their edits, this piece of me had slipped past their net. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. For the first time in months, I wasn't powerless. I wasn't erased. I was holding a weapon my family didn't even know I had. I moved quickly. Old instincts came back, the habits of double-checking, of documenting. I called a financial advisor I hadn't spoken to since before my mother died. Someone I trusted precisely because he had no ties to Vivian or Damon. His voice on the other end was cautious, professional. But when I told him about LinksGen, he grew quiet. Then he said, "Elena, do you understand what you're sitting on?" "I do now," I whispered. Together, we began restructuring. Offshore accounts, new trusts, clean lines that led back to me and only me. For every account they had locked, I built a new one. For every document they had tampered with, I created one under my sole control. Each step was careful, deliberate. By midnight, I was staring at a fresh portfolio, a network of assets that no executor could touch. LinksGen was my anchor, and through it, I was no longer a shadow. But this wasn't just about money. It was about leverage. For months, my family had acted with the smug certainty that I couldn't fight back. Now, I had the power to show them that their edits were not permanent. That while they were busy rewriting me out of the story I had been writing, a new one behind their backs. I drafted a single note before shutting down my laptop. Just 7 words on a sticky pad I pressed to the folder holding my mother's letter. "I'm not erased. I'm only beginning." The next morning, I woke with a clarity that almost frightened me. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was moving. And if they thought humiliation and denial were enough to break me, they hadn't seen what it looks like when the ghost fights back. The first strike didn't come in a courtroom or a boardroom. It came in whispers. 2 days after I secured my stake in LinksGen, I woke to a headline that made my stomach clench. Sources close to the Carver family express concern for Elena's well-being. The article was dressed in velvet, full of phrases like fragile, unstable, overwhelmed by grief. It didn't accuse me outright. It didn't need to. The implication was Elena Carver couldn't be trusted, at first. I told myself it was coincidence, just a lazy journalist parroting gossip. But then more followed. Tabloids, business blogs, even a society column that usually stuck to charity galas, all repeating the same narrative. Poor Elena, the sister who couldn't cope. It spread quickly, like smoke. Old colleagues stopped replying to emails. A board advisor I'd known for years sent a message that chilled me. Viv forwarded me something about a breakdown. Confidential? I don't know what to believe. That was their weapon. Not proof, not law. Sympathy. Sympathy turned sharp enough to cut me down without a single blade. If I tried to defend myself, I'd look defensive. If I stayed silent, their version would harden into fact. And then came the documents. A polished internal memo leaked from Damon's firm, written with professional precision, in light of recent emotional struggles. "We recommend compassion, discretion, and distance regarding Ms. Carver." The words dripped. With false care. They weren't calling me crazy, they were painting me as fragile. Too fragile to handle assets. Too fragile to lead. Too fragile to stand. I stared at the printout, jaw tight, heart steadying into something colder. They thought they were clever, but I recognized the tactic. Change the conversation, shift the spotlight. Erase me not with scissors this time, but with pity. And it worked at least in part. Friends grew distant. Invitations dried up. Even the few allies I thought I still had started speaking to me in careful tones. Like I might shatter mid-sentence. For a moment, I almost believed them. Almost. I caught myself in the mirror one night, repeating their words in my head: unstable, fragile, ungrateful. I saw the danger of it, how easy it would be to let their lies replace my reflection. But then I remembered my mother's voice on that grainy video. "You are the light that keeps this family real." Her words cut through their whispers. If they wanted the world to see me as fragile, I would show the world just how sharp fragility could become. So I didn't issue a press statement. I didn't chase the rumors. I let them swirl, let them spread. Because while they were busy painting me out of the picture, I was preparing the canvas for something they could never erase. They called it a family legacy meeting. The words alone carried the weight of arrogance, as though legacy were something they could summon with a calendar invite. The location was their choice. Of course, Damon's firm in Midtown Manhattan. The kind of glass and walnut tower designed to intimidate. I arrived at 9:58 a.m. sharp. Not early enough to look desperate, not late enough to look careless. Just enough to make every head turn when the doors clicked shut behind me. The boardroom stretched like a stage. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a polished table that gleamed under recessed lights, chairs already filled with familiar faces. Damon, at the head, posture sharp, hands folded like a judge about to deliver a sentence. Vivian to his right, mask-perfect smile fixed in place. The kind she wore for cameras even. Though none were here, no one rose to greet me. No one offered a hand. They hadn't invited me to participate. They had invited me to witness my own erasure. I walked to the far end of the table, unhurried, set my laptop down, and connected to the conference screen on the wall. The display flickered alive, and suddenly my presence filled the room. For a moment, I didn't speak. I let the silence stretch, let them wonder if I had anything at all. Damon leaned back, lips twitching in a smirk. Vivian sipped her water, eyes steady on me like a cat pretending disinterest. Then I began. My voice calm, measured. This is a chronological breakdown of every legal document tied to the Carver estate over the past 10 years. Included are access logs, signature metadata, and document control chains. Click. The first slide appeared. Dates, IP addresses, log entries that didn't match my presence. The timeline glowed across the screen, sharp and undeniable. I heard a chair creak, someone shifting uncomfortably. No one spoke. Click. A scanned contract appeared, the power of attorney they had once claimed I signed at 21. Granting Damon financial oversight. This signature, I said evenly, was dated the day I was in Milan delivering a keynote at a research summit. I tapped my keyboard, and evidence filled the screen. Boarding pass, timestamped photo, transcript. From my speech, proof I could not have signed what they waved as gospel. The silence in the room thickened. Damon's fingers tapped once against the table, a crack in his facade. Vivian's smile faltered for half a second before returning, tighter this time. I clicked again. The next slide wasn't just data. It was a revelation. Links Gen Technologies, I said, my tone sharpening. A company you dismissed a decade ago as a foolish gamble. Today, valued at nearly $1 billion. I paused, scanning their faces, and the shares, untouched. Still mine. I tapped once more. The screen blinked, then displayed a live transfer confirmation. Numbers rolled across the display, 9 zeros that landed like a gavel. Transferred to a trust in my name alone. You could feel it. The oxygen seemed too thin. Damon's smirk vanished. Vivian's hand tightened around her glass until it trembled just slightly. The others avoided my eyes, their rehearsed composure cracking under the weight of numbers that spoke louder than whispers. This isn't what Mother intended, Vivian finally said, voice lower than usual. I looked at her directly, unflinching. No, it's exactly what she prepared for. You just thought I'd never wake up to it. For a long moment, no one argued. No one dared. Papers that had been laid neatly in front of them were now meaningless. The narrative they had built collapsed under the weight of hard evidence and harder money. One by one, they stood. No adjournment, no closing remarks. Just a quiet exodus of bodies who no longer knew how to hold their own authority. Chairs scraped, notepads were left behind. The meeting ended without ending at all. I stayed seated, calm, unhurried, letting the silence belong to me for once. Then I closed my laptop slowly. slipped the folder back into my bag, and rose. As I turned toward the door, a junior associate, someone I barely recognized, passed me. He paused, glanced around to be sure no one was watching, and slid a folded note across the table toward me. His eyes flickered with something between pity and warning. I opened it as the door clicked shut behind him. 7 words in hurried handwriting. "They're planning something. Watch your back." I folded the note and tucked it into my jacket. I didn't flinch. I didn't ask questions. I just whispered to myself as I walked out, "Let them plan." I already flipped the table. Power shifts never stay quiet for long. The morning after the boardroom implosion, I expected silence. Instead, I woke to movements subtle but unmistakable. It began with the car. A black sedan, tinted windows, parked across the street from my apartment. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. New neighbors, someone waiting for a friend. But it stayed. Morning, afternoon, evening, the same car, same spot. Engine idling just long enough to be noticed. The first night, I pulled my curtains closed and ignored it. The second night, I caught myself pressing my ear to the window, heart drumming, waiting for the engine to turn over. By the third night, I knew it wasn't chance. Someone wanted me to feel watched. Then came the calls. Always from blocked numbers, always the same rhythm, 3 rings, then silence. I picked up once. A pause, then a low mechanical voice. "You should stop." No threat, no name, just those 3 words, stripped of emotion. I hung up slowly. My hands steady even though the rest of me wasn't. They weren't coming after my accounts now. They were coming after my nerves. But the most chilling blow came from within the family itself. A cousin Julian called me late one evening. He was one of the quieter ones, someone who usually hovered at the edges of gatherings, never raising his voice. He didn't waste time with greetings. "Alina," he said, his voice thin, urgent, "you need to be careful. Vivian's not stopping. She's talking about declaring you unfit. Legally. Getting doctors to sign papers. If she can't erase you from the documents, she'll erase you another way." My blood ran cold. Institutionalization. The final weapon. Make me look unstable enough to be locked away. And suddenly, every whisper, every article, every memo about fragility would click neatly into place. It wouldn't matter how much evidence I had. If they discredited me as mentally unfit, I'd lose the fight before it even began. I thanked him quietly. But after he hung up, I sat in the dark, staring at the envelope still on my desk, the one with my mother's letter and USB. Her voice echoed again in my mind. "If they erase you, fight." That night, I didn't sleep. I moved through my apartment, collecting everything that mattered: documents, drives, notes, even the sticky pad where I had scrawled my first declaration. "I'm not erased, I'm only beginning." I stored them in a locked case, photographed everything, twice, and sent copies to a secure server outside the country. If they wanted to bury me, they'd have to dig through proof that reached further than their reach. By dawn, the car was still there, waiting. I stood at the window with my coffee, watching the silhouette behind the glass. My fear was still there, too, but it felt different now. Fear no longer chained me. It sharpened me. If they wanted war beyond the boardroom, I was ready. And the first step would be using my mother's words, not just as comfort, but as a weapon. It came on a Sunday afternoon, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of day you'd never expect to carry weight. A knock at my door pulled me from my desk. When I opened it, I found Marcus standing there again, hat in hand, his expression heavy. He didn't step inside. He just held out a small envelope, its paper yellowed at the edges, the seal still intact. "She gave me 2, he said softly. "Told me this one was only for when things got dangerous. I think you're there now." My hands trembled as I took it. The paper felt fragile, as though time itself wanted to keep it from being opened. Marcus nodded once, then turned and left without another word. I sat at the table for a long time before I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet, my mother's handwriting looped and uneven from her final days. The words were fewer this time, but sharper. "If they will not follow, take what is yours. You were always the one who saw where the foundation cracked. Trust that. Do not wait for them to hand you a place you were meant to build your own." No metaphors, no softness, just instructions. My chest ached as I read it, because I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit: she had known exactly how far Vivian and Damon would go. She hadn't been blind. She had been preparing me. I pressed the page flat on the table, tracing the strokes of her pen with my fingertip. For months, I had wondered if I was imagining things, If grief had made me paranoid. If whispers were louder in my head than in reality. But here it was confirmation from the only voice that mattered. My mother had seen it all coming, and she had trusted me to finish what she couldn't. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the first one. Beside the USB. Together, they formed something more powerful than evidence. They were clarity. Proof that my fight wasn't selfishness or greed, it was survival. The fear of being erased eased slightly, replaced with something steadier. Resolve. They could smear me, lock me out, even try to have me declared unfit, but they couldn't. Take this from me. Her words were carved deeper than their edits. That night, I didn't pace the room. I didn't check the window for the car across the street. I sat at my desk, the letter in front of me, and I began outlining my next steps. Not in anger, not even in desperation, in precision. Because if they wanted to fight with whispers and shadows, I was done playing on their terms. It was time to turn her instructions into action. The invitation arrived in an email with no fanfare, no bold letters, just a simple subject line. Nomination confirmed, National Women's Leadership Summit. For a long time, I stared at the screen, half expecting the words to vanish like all the others tied to my name had before. But they didn't. They held steady, waiting for me to accept. I did. Weeks later, I found myself standing backstage in a grand ballroom lit with soft gold lights. The air buzzed with anticipation, the murmur of hundreds of women executives, leaders, builders, mothers, people who knew what it meant to carry weight in silence. I had spoken at meetings, defended myself in boardrooms, survived whispers in empty rooms. But this was different. This wasn't defense. This was declaration. The stage manager gave me a nod. The house lights dimmed. Then my name appeared on the giant screen behind the podium. Alina Carver, spelled correctly. No edits, no erasures. For the first time in years, I heard it spoken aloud, with respect. Please welcome Alina Carver. Applause rose, not thunderous, not forced, but steady, genuine. It wrapped around me as I walked onto the stage. Each step deliberate, each one laid like a brick on a foundation I had built myself. I reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and let silence hang for a moment. Silence had once been their weapon against me. Tonight, it was mine. I never wanted a war. I began, my voice even, steady. I only wanted a seat. When none was offered, I built the table myself. The room stilled, faces leaned forward. I told them pieces of my story, what it feels like to be cropped out of family photos, cut from group chats, written out of documents that should have carried your name. I spoke about the humiliation of being called unstable because I didn't scream, ungrateful because I didn't bow, about the cruelty of erasure so subtle, so persistent, that you start to wonder if you exist at all, and then I told them the truth. My mother left me in her final words, that silence can be armor, that absence can be proof, and that sometimes survival isn't about shouting louder, it's about standing long after the shouting stops. My voice trembled once when I said, they erased me in rooms full of noise, but she gave me my name back in a whisper. But I steadied, I always did. I closed with a story I had never told before. The moment Damon called me a beggar in that glittering hall. The laughter that followed, the sting of humiliation sharp enough to split bone. I let it sit in the air for a moment before I said, slowly, funny thing. Today, they line up to serve me. There was no laughter, just silence, deep and heavy, and then hands came together. Applause long, sustained, rising not in bursts, but in waves, as though the room had found its breath again. I stepped off stage without looking back. The applause followed me into the wings, into the quiet, into the part of myself that had once wondered if I would ever belong. That night, I returned to my apartment, the city glowing outside my window. I didn't feel triumphant in the way I imagined. There was no confetti, no victory parade. Instead, there was a steadier kind of peace, the kind that comes when you no longer need their table, their approval, their permission. I sat at my desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out the 2 letters and the USB. My mother's voice echoed again in my mind. If they erase you, fight. I realized then that I hadn't just fought for a name in a will or a seat in a room. I had fought for the right to exist on my own terms. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. Not because they finally saw me, but because I had stopped waiting for them to. In the end, I learned that erasure is only permanent if you let it be. They tried to silence me with whispers, but I turned those whispers into my strength. A legacy isn't something handed down, it's something you choose to build. Brick by brick, even when no one believes you can. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story of resilience, betrayal, and survival. Your support keeps these stories alive.